During World War II, many prison camps for prisoners of war and correctional facilities were overcrowded. This was especially true for the Nazi concentration camps, where numerous women found themselves imprisoned. One such camp was Ravensbrück, a place that became a symbol of fear and suffering for hundreds of women. It was a death camp, but for some of the prisoners, it became a place of heroism, though the story was rarely made public. The women who ended up here endured harsh conditions, hunger, violence, constant interrogations, and forced labor. In Ravensbrück, many were condemned to die. Yet there were those who continued to fight for their lives and the lives of their comrades. One such example was the mysterious movement that began in the camp. No official documents mention this, but it became known that in several concentration camps, women found a way to break the strict rules. They started secretly passing food to their fellow prisoners. How did this happen? Despite the dire circumstances, women devised incredible ways to smuggle food into the camp, bypassing guards and surveillance cameras. The food, which was usually provided in small rations and often of such poor quality that the prisoners couldn't eat it, began to be secretly passed from hand to hand. Several women, forming small groups, organized encrypted messages that helped them navigate this harsh world. One of the simplest but most effective ways they used was hiding food in their clothing. Women hid food in their pockets, concealing it under layers of clothes. At first glance, these supplies seemed unremarkable. Often, they looked like torn pieces of fabric or poorly sewn cloth, but in reality, they concealed food. Sometimes they hid small amounts of bread or vegetables, other times cheese, which they managed to acquire through other channels. However, the biggest problem was that every food transfer carried a huge risk. At every step, there could be searches, where everything from shoes to hair was checked. Yet despite this, the women continued their dangerous work, knowing that their actions not only affected their own survival, but also the lives of their sisters in suffering. Despite the harsh conditions, this underground network began to function. Within a few months, life in the camp became a little easier for those at the heart of this system. Women helped one another. Not only did they pass food, but also shared medicines, doing everything possible to ease the suffering of their fellow prisoners. With each passing day, this network became more organized. More and more prisoners became part of this hidden aid, and more women began to realize that their actions could save lives. Each morning began with waiting. Each day brought new possibilities and new threats. And yet, despite the constant searches, humiliation, and fear, the women continued working for the benefit of each other. Even in the most brutal conditions of war, when it seemed that hope was lost, they found ways to help those around them. These actions had no place in the official war chronicles, but they became part of the reality behind the barbed wire. These events didn't have loud names or titles, but they were important. In that moment, amid endless suffering and pain, the women's strength of will and determination to keep fighting became not just a means of survival, but also an inspiration to those trapped in this hell. As the war raged on, the conditions inside Ravensbrück and other concentration camps grew increasingly dire. The prisoners faced extreme deprivation, violence, and despair. For many, the camp was a place where they could no longer see any hope of survival. The constant threat of death hovered over them every day, and the cruelty of the guards made it clear that their lives meant little in the eyes of their captors. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, there was a quiet resistance taking place behind the camp's wire fences. A resistance led by the women who were determined to survive, and more importantly, to help each other survive. The food situation in Ravensbrück was as grim as the rest of the camp's conditions. Rations were scarce and of poor quality. The bread, if it could even be called that, was hard and stale, often molded and accompanied by thin soup that was little more than water with a few vegetable scraps. The women were often hungry, weak, and malnourished, their bodies slowly deteriorating from lack of proper nutrition, yet they still managed to find ways to help one another. In the face of extreme adversity, the women began to organize. At first, it was a few small, quiet exchanges. Bread passed from one woman to another. Vegetables slipped into a coat pocket. A small piece of cheese handed off between friends. But these acts of kindness, which seemed insignificant at first, soon grew into something much more intricate. What began as isolated acts of defiance turned into a carefully orchestrated network that spanned the entire camp. Each woman had a role, and the success of the operation depended on their ability to stay calm, stay organized, and stay hidden from the ever-watchful eyes of the guards. The network was not just about passing food. It was about survival in its purest form. There were women who were skilled at sewing, who would stitch pockets into the seams of their clothes where they could hide small pieces of food. Others were adept at smuggling, slipping unnoticed through the camp to make deliveries in secret. They passed information as well about the movements of the guards, about searches, and about potential risks to the network. Every action was carefully planned and coordinated, as any slip-up could mean a death sentence. The women relied on a system of signals and code. A glance, a gesture, a carefully placed word. These were the means by which they communicated. They could not afford to speak openly about their plans, for the walls had ears. The guards, constantly patrolling the camp, were ever watchful for any sign of rebellion or insubordination. It was this danger that made the network even more impressive. Despite the ever-present threat of discovery, the women continued to work in the shadows, knowing that their actions could save lives. As the network grew, so too did the risks. The guards were becoming more suspicious, more aggressive in their searches. Women who had been caught in the act of smuggling food were often punished severely. Some were beaten, others were thrown into solitary confinement, and a few simply disappeared without a trace. The fear of getting caught hung over everyone, but the desperation of hunger and the desire to help one another outweighed that fear. The work was dangerous, and yet it was a form of resistance. It was not a rebellion in the traditional sense, but a refusal to submit completely to the dehumanizing conditions of the camp. For the women involved, the network was a lifeline, a way to maintain a sense of control, to hold on to their humanity in a place that sought to strip it away. It was their way of saying that, despite everything, they were still alive, still fighting, still able to care for one another. In the midst of the horrors of the camp, these small acts of defiance began to have a ripple effect. Women who had been on the brink of despair found new strength in knowing that they were not alone. The food that was passed from hand to hand became more than just nourishment. It became a symbol of solidarity. It was a way of saying that even in the darkest of places, there could still be light. As the months passed, the network became increasingly sophisticated. The women had learned to be more cautious, more clever in their methods. They had figured out how to get food into the camp from outside sources. Some would hide food in packages sent from the outside, disguised as personal belongings. Others would manage to sneak small amounts of food in from the surrounding areas during forced labor assignments. Each successful delivery was a small victory, a testament to their resilience. The network was also growing in size. More and more women were becoming involved, and the women who had once been isolated in their suffering now found themselves part of something much larger, a movement that was quietly taking place inside the camp. The women of Ravensbrück, who had once been powerless in the face of such brutality, were slowly turning the tide in their favor, one small act of defiance at a time. Despite the continued dangers and the ever-present fear of being caught, the network persisted. It became a testament to the power of solidarity, the power of women to fight not just for their own survival, but for the survival of those around them. The women of Ravensbrück proved that even in the most hopeless of situations, even in the face of overwhelming odds, there was still room for compassion, for resistance, and for survival. The network of women who had started to secretly smuggle food in Ravensbrück was growing stronger and more organized with each passing day. However, as the risks of their actions became clearer, so did the costs. It was not only the fear of punishment that haunted them, but also the constant vigilance of the guards, who were beginning to notice something unusual. The women who were once invisible in the vast machinery of the camp were now becoming a threat, one that had to be eliminated at all costs. The guards, who had always been cruel, became even more ruthless as the months wore on. They intensified their searches, often dragging women out of their barracks at night, inspecting their clothing and their meager possessions with increasing suspicion. It was clear that they were looking for anything that could suggest defiance. The slightest slip-up could lead to brutal consequences. Women who had been caught with food or other forbidden items were beaten mercilessly. Those who were found guilty of conspiring to smuggle supplies were often taken to the infamous punishment block, where they faced even more violent retribution. The punishment for breaking the rules was severe. Women caught in the act of aiding others were often subjected to physical abuse that left lasting marks on both their bodies and spirits. The cruelest form of punishment, however, was the threat of being sent to the gas chamber. For many women, the constant knowledge that they could be executed at any moment was a reminder of just how precarious their existence truly was. Still, despite the looming threat, the women refused to stop. They knew that the food they passed from one to another was often the difference between life and death. Those who had gained even a small amount of weight, who had managed to hold on to a shred of health, were able to carry on longer to survive in a place designed to destroy them. It was a silent, invisible rebellion. They were not fighting with weapons or speeches, but with acts of care, kindness, and defiance. The food was not only essential for survival, it became a symbol of their resilience. It was a message that they had not been completely broken, that they had not lost their humanity in the face of unimaginable suffering. Every small victory, every successful transfer of food or medicine was a way of asserting control over a situation that was overwhelmingly beyond their control. However, the constant threat of punishment hung over them. The women who were part of the network knew that any moment could be their last. They had no guarantee of success, and they had no idea when the next raid might come. The risk was always there, but so too was the hope. The hope that by helping one another, they could survive just a little longer and perhaps, eventually, help others do the same. One of the most dangerous aspects of the food smuggling operation was the involvement of outsiders. Some women were able to sneak food into the camp from the outside world, but this posed even greater risks. The women who helped to smuggle food from the outside were at risk of being caught by the authorities, and if they were, their fate was no less certain than that of the prisoners inside the camp. The lines between the women in the camp and those who risked their lives to help them were becoming more blurred. They had become part of a larger network, one that was connected not just by shared suffering, but by a shared determination to resist. As the weeks turned into months, the stakes grew higher. The Nazis were tightening their grip on the camp, and the women knew that they could not keep their operations a secret forever. The risks were escalating, and soon, the consequences for getting caught would be even worse. But for the women who had already seen death in so many forms, there was little left to fear. They had already witnessed unimaginable suffering, and their desire to help their fellow prisoners outweighed any potential punishment. The Food Network became a lifeline for those who had lost everything, their families, their homes, and even their will to live. It was through this network that they could hold on to hope, even when it seemed like the world had abandoned them. Each piece of bread, each small scrap of cheese, each cup of water became a small rebellion against the system that sought to destroy them. These women were fighting with everything they had left, and that was more powerful than anything the camp could throw at them. Despite the constant danger, the network of women continued to operate. They had found a way to survive in the most harrowing of circumstances, not by fighting with weapons, but by supporting one another in the most meaningful way possible. Through their courage, their ingenuity, and their unyielding compassion, they proved that even in the darkest of times, human dignity could still persist. And it was this dignity that ultimately became their greatest weapon against the forces that sought to break them. As the war drew closer to its conclusion, the conditions inside Ravensbrück continued to deteriorate. The women, who had already endured so much, now faced their final test. The looming threat of liberation brought both hope and fear. As the camp, now a place of near-total chaos, spiraled toward its end. The food network that had once quietly sustained the prisoners in their fight for survival had become more important than ever. It had evolved from a simple survival tactic into a powerful symbol of resistance. Despite the ever-growing risks, the women maintained their efforts, knowing that any day could be their last. By this time, the Nazis were aware that their grip on power was slipping. The prisoners were no longer just starving and exhausted. They were filled with the hope of imminent freedom. The approaching Allied forces were a constant presence in their thoughts. They clung to the rumors of their arrival, though no one knew exactly when they would come. The camp, once a well-guarded facility, was slowly falling apart. The guards, desperate to maintain control in the face of overwhelming defeat, became even more ruthless. The terror they inflicted on the prisoners reached new heights as they conducted searches with increasing brutality. Their goal was to break the remaining will of the women, to strip them of any last shred of defiance. But despite the guards' increasingly violent measures, the women refused to break. Every act of resistance, no matter how small, became even more crucial. The smuggling of food, which had started as a simple method of survival, now represented the last flicker of hope in a world bent on their destruction. Each piece of bread, each scrap of food passed between women, was an act of rebellion against the crushing cruelty of the Nazis. The risk was immense. Getting caught could mean being beaten, sent to solitary confinement, or worse. But still, they persevered. The women in the camp began to understand that survival in these final days was no longer about just existing. It was about holding on to their humanity. The food that was passed from one woman to another was not just nourishment. It was a way to resist the dehumanization that the Nazis tried to impose on them. It was a way to say that, even though their bodies were starving, their spirits were still alive. The network of women working together to help one another, to share whatever food they could get their hands on, had become an act of collective defiance. They showed the strength of solidarity, that despite the brutality of the guards, the prison of Ravensbrück could not completely crush their will to live. As the situation grew more dangerous, the women involved in the food network took greater precautions. The risk of discovery was higher than ever. Yet, there was also a sense of urgency. They knew that the end of the war was near, and the prospect of liberation made them more determined to carry on. They continued to pass food from hand to hand, to share what little they had. For the women who were too weak to partake in the network, others did their best to feed them, knowing that the smallest amount of food could be the difference between life and death. Even in the face of constant fear, they held on to the belief that their actions, no matter how small, could save lives. The guards, aware of the growing defiance among the women, intensified their efforts to crack down on any rebellion. The network of food smugglers was no longer an isolated group of women. It was a movement that had grown in strength, even as the risks mounted. Every day felt like a new battle, a fight for survival. Some women were caught and punished harshly. Others simply disappeared without a trace. The guards, knowing they were losing control, took extreme measures to try and break the spirit of the prisoners. Yet, despite the fear and the punishments, the women never lost their resolve. When the Allies finally arrived, the camp was in a state of collapse. The women who had endured the horrors of Ravensbrück had outlasted their captors. They had clung to their humanity in the darkest of times, finding hope in each other and in their acts of resistance. The arrival of the Allied forces marked the end of the nightmare, but for the women, it was bittersweet. While they were liberated, they could not escape the scars of what they had experienced. The suffering they had endured would remain with them forever, but the fact that they had survived, that they had resisted, gave them a sense of triumph. They had proven to themselves and to the world that, even in the face of unimaginable evil, the human spirit could not be crushed completely. The women who had participated in the food smuggling network were remembered long after the war ended. Their bravery, their solidarity, and their refusal to be broken by the cruelty of the Nazis were acts of defiance that had helped them survive the horrors of Ravensbrück. Their stories, though not widely told at the time, became a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Through their courage and compassion, they showed that even in the most brutal conditions, there could still be light, and that no matter how dark the world became, humanity could still find a way to endure.